I'm Victor Valcour, and the Executive Director for the Global Brain Health Institute, and I'm going to read off notes, otherwise I won't say everything that I'm supposed to say. I wanted to welcome everybody to tonight's event. This is a salon event, which is usually a very humble opportunity for us to speak in small groups about some of the values of GBHI, but as you can see, tonight's a little bit of a larger event. We're fortunate to have John Powell from the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society and Bruce Miller from the UCSF Memory and Aging Center. Usually these values are focused around our values. These salons are focused around our values of fairness, openness, respect, courage, and empathy. And tonight is no different, but a little bit more formal because we're lucky enough to have a larger audience. This is being live streamed tonight across UCSF. It's also being recorded so that we can share some of the information with the other Atlantic Fellows programs around the world. So I'll ask you tonight to try to be quiet. We'll take questions at the end. If you're using a cell phone, please make sure it's on vibrate so that we don't get interrupted during this time. And if you need to leave during the recording, please just step around the room. I also wanted to take a little bit of time to thank the many people who put this together, particularly Suzanne Kawahara, Nicole Plata, who's not here, and Allison Reimer from the Haas Institute, who worked very hard on developing all of this for us tonight. I wanted to thank some of the special guests that are here, including Sarah Stevens, who's here from the Cuba platform, funded by the Atlantic Philanthropies, and Kavitha Medarata from the Atlantic Fellows for racial equity, for which John Powell is a partner with them for that. So you're really getting a view from several of our different programs, and we have some important people in the audience. Because this is being live streamed, I thought it would be worth saying just a couple things about what GBHI is. The Global Brain Health Institute is dedicated to protecting the world's aging populations from threats of brain health, realizing the distinct inequities in the disease, not only in the social determinants contributing to dementia itself, but the disproportionate burden that will happen in places that do not have the resources to address this issue. We also think that it compounds the stigma of aging and the stigma of mental disorders themselves. So this is how we frame ourselves as Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. GBHI works to reduce the scale and impact of dementia in three ways. We train and connect the next generation of leaders in brain health through the program Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. We collaborate to expand preventions and interventions, and we share knowledge as best we can on advocacy, engaging, and of course on the brain science of some of the values that we're trying to change around the world. The Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health program, a signature program of the Global Brain Health Institute, and with that we can highlight many of the fellows that are here in the room, but particularly want to highlight Tala Al Rousan, who is our moderator today, one of our many and all exceptional fellows that we have in the Atlantic Fellows program. Tala is from Jordan. She received her medical degree from Cairo University in Egypt, a master's degree in public health from the University of Iowa, and also did a fellowship at the Harvard School of Public Health. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Global Public Health at the University of California, San Diego, and she's an Atlantic Fellow at our institute here at Global Brain Health Institute. She's a recipient of 2 awards from the Aging section of the American Public Health Association, and she's passionate about refugee health and the welfare of refugees around the world. She's particularly passionate about Syrian refugees in her home country of Jordan. Through her Atlantic Fellowship at GBHI, she hopes to create a network of experts in brain health to reduce the disease burden in refugees. In her work, she'll leverage her public health lens to assess aging in the Middle East and the North African regions. Her focus on marginalized population and stigmatized populations make her an ideal moderator for tonight's event. I want to introduce Tala to take over.
Thank you, Dr. Valcour. Thank you, Dr. Valcour. Thank you to all of you who flew in from other parts in the United States and those who commuted locally. Thanks to everyone who's staying after hours for this on a Thursday, but we're almost there, so at the end of the week. We're super excited about today's salon with our great speakers, Dr. Miller and Dr. Powell. Let me introduce Dr. Miller. He's a distinguished professor in neurology at the University of California in San Francisco. He directs the busy UCSF Memory and Aging Center, which is an international leader in the field of memory disorders and dementia. He's a behavior neurologist focused on dementia with special interest in brain and behavior relationships, as well as the genetic and molecular underpinnings of disease. Dr. Miller started his social activism early on when he was a high school student. He's a world-renowned expert in frontotemporal dementia, which is a degeneration of the parts of the brain that control decision-making, behavior, emotion, and language. He's a lead investigator and mentor in many studies funded by the National Institutes of Health, as well as philanthropy. He's a director of the Global Brain Health Institute, and he teaches extensively. He runs the Behavior Neurology Fellowship at UCSF and oversees visits of more than 50 international visiting scholars every year. He's the author of textbooks like The Human Frontal Lobes, The Behavior Neurology of Dementia, Frontotemporal Dementia, and more than 750 other publications regarding dementia. He has been featured in Fortune magazine and the New York Times, as well as PBS NewsHour and other media. For more than 3 decades, Dr. Miller has been the scientific director for the philanthropic organization, the John Douglas French Alzheimer's Foundation, a private philanthropic organization that funds basic science research in Alzheimer's disease. Dr. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and a wide range of issues including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He's the executive director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. In addition to being a professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Powell holds the Robert Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. Professor Powell has written extensively on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice and regionalism, concentrated poverty and urban sprawl, opportunity-based housing, voting rights, affirmative action in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality and social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. He's the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Professor Powell has worked and lived in Africa, where he was a consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa. He has also lived and worked in India and done work in South America and Europe. He's one of the co-founders of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the board of several national organizations. What a pleasure it is to have you both. Let's start by asking whether you have some opening remarks that you would like to share with us.
Well, thank you both. I'm so honored and intimidated by being on this panel with 2 people who have changed the world. And I thought I better, usually I'm a little casual, but tonight I thought I better put some words together so I could get up to the level of both of you. So I wrote a little bit today about empathy. And so empathy is a good and admirable trait. Josh Kornbluth, who now is famous for his video about empathy, which I hope you all get to see, argues that empathy is central for our survival as a human species. He also told me, he went to Princeton, I only went to University of Wisconsin, so I didn't know this, but he told me that Aristotle said that we are political animals, and I think that ties very much into empathy. Most of us need to be loved, empathized with, and need to empathize with others. We're not solitary vertebrates like wolverines, Tasmanian devils, or tigers. And this concept of empathy is, I think, so central to what GBHI is hoping to accomplish. It's generated in very specific circuits in the brain. Remarkably, we've learned that the right side of the brain, the quiet, non-language side, is specialized for empathy, for what the WHO said, seeing, feeling, touching, healing. And when we injure very small parts of this right frontal circuitry, we lose the ability to empathize with other people, and it is extraordinarily socially disruptive. I think we think a lot about societies that lose their empathy, and I think nobody more than John has explained this phenomena, how it starts at a high level and how it circulates across an entire nation. It's a verbal idea, but is very nonverbal, and I'm going to try to capture that a little bit with a couple of song verses. So it's entwined with our sense of self. Suffering can enhance our ability to empathize with others, and it's often generated out of our own sense of vulnerability. Negative attempts to connect, love, make friends. So no surprise to those who know me, I want to read a little song that I felt profound empathy for the person in this song. It's a Bob Dylan song, so bear with me. Okay, so our conversation was short and sweet. It nearly swept me off my feet, and I'm back in the rain, and you are on dry land, so jilted. Bird on the horizon, sitting on a fence. He's singing his song for me at his own expense, and I'm just like that bird, oh, singing just for you. I hope you can hear me singing through these tears. So I think when I heard that song, the bird singing his heart out, wow, nothing like that to think about empathy for me. We have two pieces. Virginia Sturm has taught me this, cognitive and emotional empathy. They work very closely together. Let me give you just a very brief experience I had in Golden Gate Park where I run. So I talked to a lot of the people and used to run with my dog, and a young man came up to touch my dog. He was young, he looked fragile. I empathized with him. He leaned over, on his back was a Nazi swastika. Suddenly, this connected me to a whole cognitive system, but also a profound, quick connection with emotion as well. Suddenly, my empathy for this young man was gone. And I think a lot about that. How far can we empathize with people that we don't agree with? So here's something that a lot of you probably don't know, but if you injure that right side of the brain, other people will not empathize with you. You don't empathize with others, they don't empathize with you. If you injure the left side of the brain, people are more likely to empathize with you. My progressive language patients are profoundly stirring in empathy. So we talk about empathy, but if our right hemisphere isn't right, we don't emote it, and we can't get others to care about us. So this is, I think, leading into the huge space that John talks about. We can most empathize with those who we can identify closely to ourselves. You think of a mother and a child. There's all sorts of hormonal changes that go on during that experience, reorganization of the brain, and this is easy. But often it's important to get out of our small groups, find out who other people are, empathize with people outside of our small circle, and begin to diminish the othering that goes on more in our society now than I've ever seen it. So that's what I wanted to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a great way to ask this question, which is, thanks to you, Dr. Miller, and to other scientists, we now know that empathy is a biologically based human universal. Can you tell us more about the anatomy of empathy?
My teacher in this was originally a student of ours at UCSF. She's now associate professor, Virginia Sturm. And Virginia studies empathy in the laboratory. And she studies couples who are unable to empathize with each other, looks at what happens when people are not empathizing. She and Bob Levinson, my colleague at Berkeley, have shown that in remarkable recent data, that if the right frontal part of the brain degenerates, this dramatically influences a caregiver's outcome. So the way our brain is organized to interact with others profoundly affects their well-being. So we think of this right frontal anterior cingulate insular region, very asymmetric. You can injure that system in the left side and not see much change in empathy. When this system is lost, people can't read emotion in other faces. They don't feel other people's pain. They don't feel the normal emotions that we do. And it creates a profound disruption of social order around that person. And of course, GBHI is forced to think about the macrocosm. What happens when that empathy system is diminished in a society, when a leader encourages the diminishment of other people, diminishes empathy.
A step further and ask you, Dr. Miller, do you think there's a genetic basis for human empathy? That is evidence for a behavioral phenotype?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the profound truth is that we are profoundly alike. And so I think there are individual differences. How much of these are biological versus environmental? I think we know they can be profoundly environmental. I think a lot about outliers. I'm a behavioral neurologist, and certainly there are people in society who are less likely to empathize from the time they're children. I think school teachers see these kids as a problem. But I think there's so much remodeling that can be done at a very early age, that if a system is set up to empathize with that child, to understand that child, I think whatever biological differences they are overwhelmed by the environment that we can create. So Talita, one of our fellows, the great thing about being here is I get educated every day by my fellows, sent me a big paper about the genetics of empathy, 50,000 people, 23andMe, couldn't find it. So tells you there's a lot of environment in there, right?
So you're talking about outliers who drive society towards unempathic stances. And there must be a biology of that behavior. Dr. Powell, how do these outliers take advantage of financial or power circumstances to manipulate an entire society towards unempathic behaviors?
Well, you know, one thing I was thinking as in preparation for coming over, and I talked to Takia, who's sitting here today. We talked about this, and you know, I'm not an expert on the brain like Dr. Miller. I sort of study groups, and there are different theories. And so one of the questions is, does empathy, and we actually frame this in terms of othering and belonging, how does it happen at a mass level, not just at an individual level? And we see this, we see really extreme examples of it. And it flips on and off. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I just want to throw a curve at you early on. So I'm reading a book now called Behave, The Biology of the Best and Worst of Humans. And the author makes the point that there are at least two different kinds of empathy. He talks about empathy where you feel in the other person's pain. And he said that kind of empathy does not produce action. In fact, what it does is it focuses you on taking care of yourself, as opposed to taking the other person's perspective, which does generate action. So I think implicit in what we're talking about is empathy, and more closely aligned to compassion, which is, has the action element associated with it. And just to add one other wrinkle before I come back to your question, since Dr. Miller introduced the bird song, yesterday I was leaving my house, and under my car, it was raining here in the Bay Area, those of you here, and I looked under my car, and there's a little bird, sort of shivering. It's cold and trying to stay warm. I think it must have fallen out of a nest. I had to rush off to a meeting, so I rushed to this meeting, and then I turned around and went back home and to find this bird, and I did find the bird, but now I'd taken my car away, which was his shelter, or her shelter, and the bird was lying on its back, and I thought it's probably dead. So I went and got some gloves and took the bird into the garage and closed the door so no animal could find it in its debilitated state. And I came back later and the bird was gone. And I say that to say our ability to empathize and connect does not start and stop at humans. We actually do it across species. We obviously know many of us have pets. Species do it. Other animals will protect different animals. There's a wonderful video, if you haven't seen it, of I think it's a group of primates, and a bird has fallen out of its nest, and the primate picks the bird up and throws it up in the air, and the bird, of course, falls back down because it's injured. But then the other primates in this tribe it's like, oh, food, why are you throwing our food away? But the upshot of it is the primate protects the bird until the bird is able to fly away, which is actually an amazing story, I think. It's sort of like, and I'm sure Dr. Miller can explain what's going on. I think people have multiple abilities, and those abilities are triggered largely by situational or environmental things. I think when we talk about poverty and socioeconomic, in a way it's a system or structure that's already putting in place. In a sense, we know from a lot of work that the more unequal a society is, the less sympathetic the society. We know from the work at Berkeley and over here that people who drive fancy cars don't stop for other cars and don't stop for pedestrians as much as people who drive regular cars. And I say that in mind because I drive a fancy car, but I do stop. But that's not genetic. That's not a default gene. It's actually something going on with the environment, with the ideology, and with the biology. And I'm particularly interested in how this plays out in mass society. I know you're interested in the Middle East, and when I think about othering, not just at the individual level, but even at the group level and at the state level. We see large numbers of people are able to be activated, primed, to actually engage in horrendous action. Think of the genocide in Rwanda, where literally people had lived together for decades, if not centuries, and then they turned on each other. And one of the worst incidents was this priest, Catholic priest, who gathered 2,000 of his congregants in the church and then invited the other side to come and kill them all, and he participated in the execution. These were people he knew. I mean, it's like, what's going on? It's like, on the other hand, not to be a complete downer, some of you who study history may know of the Christmas truce in World War I. We had Germans and English lined up against each other, killing each other by the hundreds. And Christmas came, and it's like somebody came up with an idea, can we have a truce and celebrate Christmas? And so these soldiers put down their guns and started hanging out, cooking together, and it was fascinating. They actually extended it for a whole week to New Year's. And the leaders were upset. It's like, okay, enough of this. Get back to war. Get back to killing each other. And they realized in some sense that they were being manipulated. But most of them participated willingly, and some friendships actually happened afterwards, so people survived. And there was one person, though, there was a corporal who was very angry about this truce. And he reported it to the leadership. He reported it to the higher-ups because he thought, we should be killing those people. And this corporal's name was Hitler. So I think a lot of it is environmental, and we have the capacity to do tremendous stuff. And I think the socioeconomic arrangement, which is a little bit iterative, like what happens first? Is it that people are low income or poor or black or quote unquote different, and therefore, or is our action actually pushing them to the boundary. And it's not clear which comes first, but it is clear that oftentimes the elite play a special role, and the structure of society plays a special role. That these decisions, these actions are not simply individual. And so it's very concerning that a lot of the leadership around the world, including here in the United States, is actually activating the worst aspects of us. It's basically telling us, define yourself narrowly. And anyone who's not like you don't deserve to be here. They're bad people. They're a threat to you. And so activating threat and anxiety is also important. And I think in some ways that we're not fully conscious of, we oftentimes participate in what I call those breaking stories, those othering stories. And I think we have to be careful with that, even as we defend ourselves against these attacks. And I'll stop with just one last story, good story. Nelson Mandela, when he was ready to come out of Robben's Island, there was this negotiation, can they stop the killings in South Africa? And I think people are defining the killings along racial lines, around socioeconomic lines. The Afrikaners were saying these black people were not fully human. And so, but the clerk and Nelson Mandela had met and they wanted to end the killings. And, but the clerk couldn't do it without support of his top general. So he wanted he could not persuade his general. So he wanted Nelson Mandela to meet with his general. The general was like, have to meet with this black guy? What's this about? And the general believed what he was doing was right. He believed that he was protecting the purity of the Afrikaner people. So he went in to meet with Mandela. And a couple of things. First of all, Mandela served him. And I don't mean he called his help in to serve him. Mandela served him himself, which was shocking. Now, is he giving away his power? What's that about? And then as they got ready to have the discussion, the entire discussion took place in Afrikaner. Nelson Mandela had taught himself to speak Afrikaner while he was in Robben's Island. And it totally shifted the dynamics. And the general who walked in, committed to continuing the war, there was a space now open. They didn't become friends, so it's not a kumbaya story, but they shifted the war in South Africa and probably saved thousands of lives. And to me, that was sort of an incredible moment of bridging, of seeing someone else's humanity, of empathizing with someone else who, in some sense you could say, is in the dominant role, but still suffering, right? And Nelson Mandela, in some ways, without legitimizing his claims, he acknowledged them. And when you legitimize someone that way, or when you acknowledge someone that way, I think you empathize with them and you help them connect at a human level. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that. And who could, I don't know if I could have done what Nelson Mandela did. I don't know if I could sit across someone who's killed my friends and serve them tea. But anyway, and this is a really wonderful story nonetheless.
What a wonderful story, really. Dr. Powell, I pulled up an article for you in The Guardian, and I quote, "The opposite of othering is not saming, it's belonging." In your scholarship, you have been using semantics like othering and belonging. Can you tell us more about this, and how do these semantics affect our understanding of empathy?
Well, it's interesting because one of the reasons I use that, I do a lot of, certainly the first 20, 30 years of my work really focused a lot on the dynamics of the United States around race, to a lesser extent around indigenous people. And as I got more into the work, certainly in the last 10 years, it's obvious that there's a line by Bob Marley which says, every man, and maybe we say every person, thinks his burden is the heaviest. And so, and I tell the story, right? It's like, if you get, Kavita will appreciate this, we get together a number of people of color, and sometimes you have this story as to who's suffering the most, right? And so it's like, well, but we have 300 years of slavery and being taken over in the ships, and 40% of the slaves, maybe more, died in transit. Yes, but if you're Native American, we basically suffered genocide. Our population went from 2 million to under 200,000. And land was ripped off from us, and our language. So, what could be worse than genocide? And then if you're Mexican American, it's like I went to bed in Mexico and I woke up in America. They moved my boundary and no one asked me. And then they told me I was a foreigner. All those things are true. And you could continue those stories. And to some extent, we're trying to get at what story is there the most suffering, which is not a way to have a conversation. And so, although it's interesting, I've read a lot of Susan Fisk's work, and she actually does give us an empirical way of looking at othering in a gradient. So all othering is not the same. But, so othering actually acknowledge that there are many different ways in which we deny people humanity. There's not one, there are many different ways. Whether someone has a disability, I don't even like the term disability, whether someone's sexual orientation, whether someone's religion, whether someone's age, whether but it happens when it happens at a group level. And I would say age is actually interesting because it's very prominent on one hand, and yet we all, if we're lucky, will be old one day. So there's a natural way we might, and we all hopefully have grandparents or whatever. So it's not the same as, when you think of genocide, it's usually not focused on age, but it might be focused on religion. And so what I was trying to do was create a space and understand the dynamics of othering at a larger level, not just racially, not just in terms of language. When I went to Europe, I've done a lot of work in Europe, and I go and I talk about race, and people say, no, we don't have any racial problems in Europe. And I said, what about the other? Oh, you mean the Muslims? I mean, they immediately, it's like they know they have what they would see a problem, and they define it in terms of othering. In the United States, when we address the issue of othering, when we confront it, our quick response is to do what I call saming. It's like okay, you're just like me. There are a group of radical conservative, white nationalists who are saying, you're terrible, you're not human, but you're just like us. And somehow, that's maybe an improvement, but it still does not recognize me. And it doesn't require the work of recognizing me. Because if I'm just like you, there's no need to even talk to me. You can just substitute your own feelings, values, aspirations. And so, in a sense, saming is a form of colorblind. It's basically saying, we're going to wipe away all differences, and you're going to assimilate into me. And so I say that, to be clear, the solution to othering is not saming. It's not seeing the other person. It doesn't happen as much now, but it still happens, where someone says, I didn't even notice you were black. Like, that's a compliment, I want to be black. I am black. I wanted to star in the Black Panthers movie, but I guess they didn't notice I was black. But can we embrace our differences, recognizing differences themselves are constantly shifting, and still connect with each other in a way that where we belong? So that's the challenge. It's not to say, let's just eviscerate our differences and all become the same.
I think we talk about this also at GBHI, trying to change the words we use. We don't say elders anymore, we say older adults or the elderly. So the speech and the words we use do matter.
They matter a lot, and I guess, again, Dr. Miller would have more information on this. Obviously, we prime each other with speech. We actually activate things in the mind. We're having a meeting next week at the Ford Foundation, and they're prompting questions. And one question that the staff was working on is like, okay, so tell us about the most difficult part of the work and what makes it hard. And I said, okay, that's good, but we could also say, what are the greatest opportunities? So we're, instead of just priming people to think negatively, it's like, what's hard about your job? What don't you like about being here? Or you could say, what's wonderful about your job? And so not only the words and phrases, they actually activate different parts of the mind. And you see in group settings, once you sort of start people down a road, I'm sure you've all been at those meetings where you say, what did you do last summer? And someone says, I went camping, and all of a sudden, the next 5 people are all talking about road trips. They're all following, So words are very important, and unfortunately, most of the words and practices that we engage in at this time, and certainly in the United States, are words that are narrowing the we, they're breaking. And so Jeff Sessions, Attorney General, talks about our criminal justice system being founded in Anglo-American principles. You know, so what is he really saying? You know, if you so yes, I think words matter a lot.
I think that's a lesson for us also at GBHI, to try to see the beauty in dementia and aging, rather than seeing aging as a disability or something that we're afraid of or we're not ready to embrace.
I was just going to
Please,
comment on
Dr.
Dr. Powell's comments about words, and you know, and I think why they're particularly important to us, our human species, is that we have a complex biology. I was thinking of, I don't drive very much for the good of the world, but I drove today, and I was constantly shifting back and forth, unbelievably, thinking about empathy between wanting to get through lights at the expense of other people, and you know, we all live with this complex biology. I mean, we have profound capacity for empathy, but also profound capacity for selfishness and self-concern. I think a lot, and you know, we've touched on elders, is that they bring a lot to this space at their best. And I think they have a collective experience that can help put things in perspective and understand why the wrong use of words, the wrong interactions with people have such a profound, lasting effect over decades and decades. So, but I don't understand the elder political demographic in this country. That's a little bit of a problem with that idea, isn't it?
Yeah. And let me tell a quick story about elders, which I think maybe you'll enjoy. So I was speaking to a group of black pastors and Christian Baptists in Texas. And near the end of the talk, someone said, well, Professor Powell, it's a great talk, but you haven't told us which Christian church you belong to. And I said, well, you know, I'm getting older, and so you know, one of the things you do in life, you struggle with aging. It's a challenge eventually for all of us if we live long enough. And when I think of Christianity, as I recall, Jesus died when he was 33, which is younger than my son. So I don't know if I want a 33-year-old counseling me about aging. And I said, plus one of the great challenges in life is relationships, and certainly romantic relationships. And as far as we know, he didn't have one. And then I said, and then of course you worry about your parents. You know, how do you make life, how does life make sense and meaning in terms of your parents aging and dying? And his parent is God. So I'm not sure if I was, and they were like, did he just say that? So yes, I do think, and I'm fortunate that my aging father is 97. And sometimes when I get stuck on things, I still go back to him. He's dropped out of school in the 3rd grade, so he doesn't have a lot of what people call book learning. But he has a wisdom and a depth that's just profound. And my son, who was struggling, really even suicidal at one point, was home from college and locked himself in his room. And I told him he had to come out. He couldn't stay at the house. He had to look for a job. Didn't have to find one. Had to look for one. He had to get professional help, and he had to go visit his grandfather. And he objected to all, but the last one he thought was just crazy. It's like, what can this old man, who was a Christian minister, what does he know about my life? Nothing. You know, I said, well, you have to go spend at least a week with him, or you have to leave. You can't stay here. He went for a week, and he stayed 6. He came back completely transformed. And I said, so what did you and Dad talk about? He said, I'm not sure.
That's the right side of the brain, right? That's, yeah.
This question is to both of you. Under what conditions are people more or less likely to be empathic?
I want to give one anecdote. So when I was about 17, I drove across the country with my brother, and my parents had a little lapse of sanity, and they let us drive this really roaring V8 Bonneville convertible across. So we drove fast, and when I hit Montana, never did I see in the bathrooms more bigotry and hatred in my life. And I realized that this was put down, scribed on every bathroom that we saw, that from people who had never seen anyone who was African American, you know, another religion. It was all associated with ideas about other people without any actual practice or interaction. And one of the things I love about the schools in this area is, and public schools, I worry a lot about private schools that isolate kids from experiences, is that, you know, they immediately are interacting with kids with 20 different languages, all sorts of ethnic identifications. And I think it becomes much harder to other when you are, you know, shooting a basketball with another kid from a different group. So I think the areas in our country where othering is the most severe, areas where people are really isolated in pockets and have no actual practical experience, that all of these terrible ideas that, as Dr. Powell points out, are generated, being stirred up from the top. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I think there's two theories, and they seem to be in conflict, but they're not. So one is contact theory, which was actually initially proposed by Alpert in The Nature of Prejudice, and the other one is conflict theory. And so contact theory is just what Dr. Miller said, is that when people come in contact, it's hard to other when you have people in contact with you. But the other is conflict theory. And so when people come in together and they're competing, they're in conflict. So they're actually not, those two things can be resolved in an easy way, is that there's a certain type of contact. So when you come in contact where you're cooperating, where you're doing something together, where there's relative equality, you're more likely to empathize. If you come in contact where you're competing and there's sense of scarcity and there's a threat, then there's conflict. And the conflict, the threat can be symbolic. In fact, one of the greatest threats that we're symbolic beings, and we all have symbolic sacred symbols. And we fight over that. So again, going back to Nelson Mandela, and there's a movie about this. Once he got out of prison, he went to a rugby game. Rugby was one of the sacred symbols for Afrikaners, not even for the English whites. And it was very controversial. It's like, don't you know what rugby stands for? I know exactly what rugby stands for. That's where I'm going. So I think that putting people together, but actually looking at the conditions in which they're together matters a lot. So can we create relative equality? Can we create a shared goal? Can we create, then I think you're more likely to get empathy. But we live in a society that's deeply segregated. And so Dr. Miller's right. If you look at the Tea Party, and they live in the whitest part of America. In fact, recent data suggests that as the country's becoming more diverse, those populations are becoming more white. So they're removing themselves. They don't want to know someone who's black or Latino or Jewish. And so they just keep describing this we very narrowly. And the elites actually manipulating that so they can rob your money. It's a whole thing in terms of restructuring the economy. And so we have the capacity to see each other as supportive. Here's an interesting factoid I like to use and I like to throw out. We have all this stuff going on, extreme polarization. By some accounts, we have the worst polarization in the United States since the Civil War. We also have more people who are aggressively embracing egalitarian values probably than almost any time in U.S. history. We have both of those things happening at the same time. There's a concept called interfamilies, which basically means that someone in your family is of a different race or ethnicity. Or you marry someone of a different race or ethnicity. By some accounts, that's the fastest growing group in the United States. In California, by 2020, by some accounts, it will represent 50% of the state. 50, and so, so people are doing stuff. They're not staying in those narrow lanes. I have Latinos in my family. I have Asians in my family. I have whites in my family. And it changes the possibility. It's not destiny in and of itself, but it changes the possibility. If you haven't seen it, when you're not studying or working hard, go see the Black Panther. But I warn you, there are a lot of black people in there.
It's perfect, though. It's beautiful.
But Sandra Bullock was doing a show talking about the Black Panther, and she was crying. And the interviewer was like, good movie, a great movie, but I didn't cry. I mean, what's up with your crying? And she said, well, it's not just a movie to me. It's personal. I said, what do you mean it's personal? She said, I think she said, I adopted 2 black boys. I'm not, so when you look at me and think of me as, the stereotype of a white person, that's not me. My family is now multi-ethnic and multiracial. These issues are immediate. So I think that we have to just create space where we shake things up, where we can get to know each other. But where there's relative equality and relative corporations, I think we need a new story, a new story of us. And I think that matters a lot. And we need leadership.
I wonder if you probably touched on this while answering the question, but do you think privilege in terms of financial privilege or having more money does affect how we exercise empathy? We had a question coming in from Mohammed Matala, who's the CEO of Health Equity in South Africa. And he asked, how is the quality of empathy and othering affected by the life experiences of poorer people as compared to more privileged ones?
Well, those are very important questions, and they're fortunately we've had very smart people tackle them. Emeritus Sen, who's a Nobel economist, he's written extensively on this subject. Even how we think about poverty is tricky. I've written a piece where I say poverty in the United States is largely about othering itself. It's not simply about not having enough money. It's about not having enough belonging, not having enough respect. And certainly you need so much stuff to live. You need food, you need a house. But in some ways, the real degradation in the United States, certainly we have right here in San Francisco a lot of people without housing, so there is that. But there's also the sense that my doing well requires that you do not well. And to me, I define this in the most narrow sense that this is what, out of colonialism and the European experience, this is what whiteness really meant. It meant that my doing well meant that you were not doing well. Or you put it another way, my being a man means I get to dominate my woman. It's become an extension of, and so so I talk about poverty, and Sen talks about poverty. He says in India, there's never been starvation. It was never simply a lack of food. It was a lack of democracy. It was a lack of belonging. So it wasn't that they ran out of food. It's that they ran out of empathy. And so so the two are intertwined in some interesting ways. But again, the research suggests that as people become richer in terms of material richness, it actually affects the entire society in a negative way in terms of health outcomes. One of the things, of course, it does is anxiety. It's like you have to worry about other people, and you're always worried about, and that's, we are one of the richest countries in the world. We're not the happiest, but on any measure. And if you look at data from 2 years ago, and I think it's probably true now, the group of people in the United States that's the angriest, that's the most angst-driven, are white men. In terms of economic health, you say that's the wealthiest group. Actually, it's not. It's probably Asians, but close to it. They're close to the top. But they're, as a group, very anxious. And you could say, well, they're anxious because they're afraid of technology, or they're afraid the world's going to change. But it's going to change for blacks too. It's going to change for Latinos too. But they're the ones their sense of anxiety and anger was twice that of African Americans. And so I met with a rich person the other day, and he talked about being privileged. And I said, well, there's different kinds of privilege. And he wanted to talk to me about growing up poor. My father and mother were sharecroppers. I said, yeah, they were sharecroppers. We were not poor. There was so much, and still, so much love in my house. And yes, I want my dad to have good health insurance and enough food to eat, not to worry about a house to live in. But I wouldn't give up my family for $1 million. So we think of poverty in sense, from my perspective, of someone who's not belonging, someone who's not respected. And then those other things follow. We don't provide health care. We don't provide good schools. We isolate them in what we call ghettos. We disrespect them from everything. So there is a relationship in our society with, not just our society, our state, California. California has more billionaires by far than any other state in the United States. San Francisco, where we are now, a few years ago, had one fewer billionaires than New York City. We have 1/10 the population here in San Francisco. And one of the rich people in San Francisco who was, trying to be liberal, he said, we got a problem in San Francisco. It's a world-class city. There are all these people without housing, homeless, he called them. We should round them all up, buy some land in Oakland, and send them to Oakland. And this was a serious suggestion he was making. He was actually willing to put money down. It's like, okay, maybe they're people, but they shouldn't be here in San Francisco. They got a lot of extra land in Oakland, and there are a lot more people of color in Oakland. Send them to Oakland. And he actually reached out to me and some others to help him with this idea. So he didn't think of himself as, a right-wing crazy. He thought he was doing something nice. This was his idea of acknowledging that they need something, but they're not him. They're not really people. They're not full human beings. They certainly don't belong in San Francisco.
It's not surprising and pretty horrifying. I think one of the things that I think about, again, and it comes back to how a society will put out a narrative that ultimately is destructive to the society. So we have a narrative that began in the 80s, that government is bad, that people don't need a system if they start to fall. The next concept is it's their own fault. And, I think our group, Sergio Lanata has led this effort, think that if GBHI is going to succeed, we must address homelessness. And to some extent, this is an economic problem. There's clearly a group of people in this city who were homeless or were over age 50. A lot of them were not homeless until fairly recently. I think understanding a lot of these people do need a government. They do need a system to support them. Many of them have early brain disease. I think some of the most important research coming out right now is out of a Dr. Williams at UCSF, who thinks a lot about prisons. And one of the extraordinary things that she's showing is that if you have cognitive impairment and you're over the age of 50 and you were released, you end up back in prison or on the street. And so an idea that we don't need government, that we should live in our own selfish enclaves and create wealth for ourselves, it is putting a self-concept across a whole society. I don't think I've ever seen anything in my lifetime more effective than this idea that government is bad and that people should be able to make it on their own. It is one of the most destructive narratives that has driven down, I think, in our society, these empathy circuits. So, I think the words are very important. The semantics are very important, and that's, I think, why we must struggle constantly with these semantics and push back in a gentle, nice way.
Look, if I could add one more thing to that, I see two things. One, I think one of the things that's actually producing a lack of empathy in the United States and around the world is that we haven't been able to deal with, the world is becoming smaller. There are 300 million people living outside of their home, and the numbers going up. By some accounts, by the end of the 21st century, there will be no major city in Europe where the majority of the people will be white. And if you're a white person with an ideology, consciously or unconsciously, of exclusion, of domination, that's a scary thing. And the research suggests that a lot of people are afraid of that. And so when they complain about immigrants in Europe, they're not complaining about Italians going to Germany. They're talking, it's a racial and religious other that somehow becomes threatening. But this ideology that Dr. Miller talks about is so important. I was talking to a friend the other day who's 70 years old, and he's made a lot of money, and he lost a lot of money. So now he's, sort of trying to retire. And this is what he said to me. He says, I paid millions and millions in the Social Security. I think it's okay if I take something out. But he was feeling guilt and shame for needing Social Security. So it's not even just that we don't give to people. When they have to receive help, they're made to feel belittled in some way. And you see that most extreme now in the United States. There's a study looking at low-income blacks and low-income whites. And the way they deal with their circumstances generally is radically different. Because the low-income blacks are more likely to say, following hard times, and we actually visited some communities. They're more likely to share, not perfect by any means. The low-income whites, as you know, are killing themselves, literally, and feeling ashamed of needing anything from the government. And some of them even say they hate the government while the government is giving them stuff because they need the government. I mean, it's like this really twisted psychology, and part of it's based on this narrative, this ideology that if you're a good person, you don't need anything from anybody else. And everybody needs something from somebody else. And this really lack of empathy that's becoming epidemic in our society turns on oneself, I believe, as well. That if you can't see the other, if you can't connect with the other, if you can't care about the other, your ability to care about yourself, in part because there is no other, and we have different aspects of ourselves. So can we actually embrace the different aspects of ourselves? And I was talking to a friend about King. I'm going down to do some work with the King family in a couple of weeks. And he was saying, King was a great man, but he had clay feet. There's stories about him womanizing and all that. And I said, yeah, he was a great man, and he did have clay feet. And to me, that doesn't detract from his greatness, that adds to his greatness. The fact that people who are imperfect can struggle and still do wonderful things is more amazing. It's less amazing if someone never has an issue, never have to struggle with it. So can we care and love each other with all our warts and pimples, or do we just save that for the Godchild? Maybe it doesn't need our love.
As Atlantic Fellows, we should be comfortable with the idea of giving empathy, receiving empathy, and co-creating empathy. I struggle sometimes with the definition of empathy as putting yourself in some other shoes, for two reasons. Reason number one, it's impossible to do. I work with refugee communities. I really tried hard to understand what it takes to be a refugee. What does it feel like to be a refugee? I went to refugee camps. The bombings were near me. I was receiving refugees on the borders. I still could not feel how they feel. I couldn't see the struggle and be in their shoes. It's really hard. Number two, when you're asked to be in someone else's shoes, you're making assumptions about these people. And that's dangerous. That's risky and dangerous. My modest idea is the way we can overcome this is think of empathy as trying to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and being cognizant about the fact that we're proactively trying. And the only way to do this is through building bridges, connecting, communicating, being there with the groups that we're trying to serve, spending time with them, being with our patients and trying to understand their agony, being in the community we're trying to serve. What do you think of this?
I love that. And I just wanted to comment on something I've learned about in this space. And actually, I watched John talk about it a little bit, about that we are not human doings. We are human beings. Mm-hmm. And I think I've learned a lot in the last 6 months to a year that, we have these two very simple systems that we approach the world with. One is parasympathetic, which is relaxed, open, social. This is what people tap into when they meditate. This is what I think therapists tap into. This is what an empathic person does when they are working with, populations that need help. And then we have a sympathetic system that is designed for fight and flight. And, I think one of the things that we've learned from great healers and people who do the most is that they perfect this parasympathetic system that steps back, that looks, that observes, that doesn't necessarily talk. And, I think this is, the observation that sometimes we aren't empathizing, but we have this cognitive sense of self that, protects us in those times when we're not empathic. The patient that we're not as empathic as we should be about. We also have this cognitive system and this system of altruism that we perfect that allows us to step into those circumstances and heal and do things that are valuable.
So I think your insight is actually quite nuanced and complicated. And I would actually just push you in two directions. One, not to set up a binary. Either we can or we can't. We actually don't know where the boundary is. And there are theories of the mind, the whole literature about theory of the mind. And in those theories of the mind, one of the things they said, and I don't know what Dr. Miller would think about this, is that the brain is radically individual, the mind is radically social. So I don't think we have to step in someone else's shoes as a metaphor, but I think we have to care. I think we have to be empathetic. I like the word compassion because compassion means to suffer with. And Charles Taylor has written a lot about what he calls the politics of recognition. There's a term in South Africa, a Zulu term called Sabawanu, which means I see you. We want to be seen. And when people make the effort to see us, not to know us, not to start with assumption, I know what you need, I know who you are. No, I want to hear you. I want to feel you. That's the healing space. I'm not becoming you. And it seems to me that in that space, really incredible things happen. And as Dr. Miller suggested, is that empathy is not necessarily verbal. But I think all of us have had examples of being seen and how healing that can be. I came back from India with a deadly disease, and I went around from doctor to doctor, and it was a disease from somewhere in southern India, so they didn't have it in their Western medical books. And they basically were saying, well, maybe you're hypochondriac. I mean, maybe you're not really sick. It's like, okay, so I don't know why you lost 50 pounds, but I don't see anything in the book that explains this. And it was just so frustrating. Then I went to this doctor, this woman, and she looked in her book. She said, I don't know what you have, but it must be incredibly hard and scary to be carrying a disease that no one can name. And I just started crying. And it's at that point that I started healing. She didn't give me a special medicine, but she saw me. She didn't become me. She didn't become sick. But she basically said, I see a human being suffering, and I recognize that. And so, yeah, I think there's a danger, which implicit in what you said, of like, I know what it's like to be, no, I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be, short.
It's tough, John, actually. It's very tough.
But it doesn't mean I can't extend myself, and it doesn't mean I can't listen. It doesn't mean I can't give other people space. It doesn't mean I can't suffer with. So I do think there's, like I said, what you said is very nuanced, but I don't think we should make it into a binary.
The essence of being an Atlantic Fellow is to work towards social justice. how do we translate what we have learned from you both today into tangible action, into things that we should carry on and carry with us as we move forward in our missions all around the world?
Well, I learned something really profound tonight that really changed the way I think about empathy. And it was the piece that I was missing was the piece that does. And I think that's what Dr. Powell really talked about. And I think that's where the concept of compassion and doing, interacts with this abstract system of feeling others and thinking about others. But the doing part is the most important. So I talk with Victor Valcour a lot about this. Yes, we need to train academics, but if our first line efforts aren't around the homeless in this city, the poorest, the most isolated people with cognitive disorders, treatable disorders, many of them, then this is very abstract and less meaningful. And I think Atlantic knows that. That's why they're funding systems that are talking about changing society. We heard explicitly from Atlantic, we don't want you to train people who write papers. Yes, we want people to write papers, but we really want you to train people who want to change the society that they're in. And I think that's really the ultimate message. And that's a whole other system in the brain, Dr. Powell, that I'm going to have to think more about. That's that system that goes out and does.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, my guess, one reason Atlantic said, we don't want you to train people to write papers because you already know how to write papers. I mean, it's sort of like that muscle is well developed. So I think this is a lifelong work. This is life itself as far as I'm concerned. Periodically people will say, so how did you decide to do this work? It's like, how could you not do it? And call yourself a humane being. And how you express that will vary, and you hopefully will continue to learn. The brain continues to be plastic, so we'll continue to learn. There'll be opportunities. And the research, which is important, will reveal things. And because we can't do everything, doesn't mean we should do nothing. And we're learning a lot. For example, there's a concept called ambience belonging. Like, how do you create an environment where the environment is sending a message that you belong? And a lot of times we create environments that says you don't belong. I was being recruited to the University of Texas at Austin, and they were serious about the recruitment. They actually offered some decent money and wanted me to set up an institute there. And I said, taking me around campus, they're saying, and don't pay attention to the Confederate memorabilia we have all over campus. But I know that the unconscious is paying attention. And it's basically saying, this is not my place. Yeah. And maybe these are not my people. And so how do we actually do that? And then sometimes it's also, so it's at the structural design level, but it's also at the personal level. For 3 years, I lived right next to Dolores Park, and a huge population of people who were homeless. And I got to know some of them. And there was one woman in particular, and I'll call her Gladys, and I would talk to her and I'd give her money. And one day I came home from traveling, and I saw a woman friend of mine. And I gave her a big hug, and we were chatting each other out. And then I saw Gladys, and whenever I'd see her, I'd say, is everything okay, Gladys? Do you need something today? And she'd just say, I want to need to buy some food, and I'd give her money. So I walked up to her and I said, how you doing, Gladys? Do you need anything today? And she just was quiet for about 30 seconds. And then she said, would you mind giving me a hug? And I hesitated because she was, disheveled, smelly, overweight. And I in my mind thinking lice, this, that, and the other. And it was easier to give her $20, right, than to give a hug. But she was now. I don't know what she goes through. I don't know even necessarily where she sleeps, although I let people sleep in my driveway. But I don't know her day-to-day struggle. But what she was saying to me is, I need to be recognized as a human being, not as a person without housing. And so I did give her a hug. And then after that, every time I'd see her, she said, can you give me a hug today? And she needed to be really connected and touched. And it was, to me, that was a wonderful gift for me. And the fact that I struggled with was also, it's like, yeah, I have my concerns. And I'll stop at this. I saw another friend after I saw Gladys and gave her a hug. And she ran up to me and said, John, you're back. I said, you can give me a hug, but you know I just was embracing this homeless person. So she said, no, we can hug later.
Can I
Dr.
make one
Miller,
more comment
yes,
about what GBHI fellows, Atlantic fellows should be thinking about? And this is complex and it's hard for me. But I just want to give an anecdote. So Josh Kornbluth, who put together, I think, this lovely, incredibly important piece on empathy, we talked a long time, and I wanted to include a piece from President Obama talking about the politics of empathy. I mean, it's a beautiful piece. This is a man who, understood the brain and, why this was so important for our country. And we went on and talking about this, and we had thoughts we were going to show President Trump being unempathic, and then one of the people in our group said, well, my mother-in-law from West Virginia is in town, and she's really angry, and she's a Trump supporter, and so we directed our empathy piece toward her. And so we talked about empathy, we talked about why it's important to the world. We have more work to do with her, but I will say that we've been told that she's sending this empathy video broadly. So I think being effective is sometimes a little different than, saying everything you're thinking about. And for me, and Victor too, this is a really hard system to suppress, right?
Dr. Miller, Dr. Powell was saying when he was about to hug that lady, some things were going on in his brain. Knowing what we know about the working of the brain, are there specific techniques we can do to control this brain so that we become more empathic?
Oh, I think so. I think it's doing. Every time we do something like this, and we become better, we become more empathic. It's easier to release that oxytocin. We have bigger hypothalamus. We're building synapses constantly in this system. We go to war, we learn how to hate people, other people hurt people, and then when those people come back and hurt other people, we're surprised. So, yeah, it's no surprise. I think it is the practice of decency, caring about other people, seeing injustice. I think this is shaping our fellows' brains. And my goodness, I mean, this man, I'd love to study this brain. There's the answer, right there.
Again,
Tala, I have to say, the work that you started doing also extraordinary. I mean, it's not easy work. There's an authenticity and a courage. And I think to be truly empathic requires this. It requires courage and authenticity. And these are the brain systems that somehow you were taught and inherited that took you out of an easy life and an easy place. And
actually, I wanted to touch on this. Most of us here, or all of us as Atlantic Fellows, we're taking risky career steps by stepping into sometimes work that is not funded as well, work that is not appealing to other people as well. And we cannot operate without looking at what's happening in the world in general. Things aren't looking so good in the world. There is a rise on the far right. We have the largest number of refugees in the world since World War II. We have climate change and people denying that. In the thick of adversity, when we sometimes are brought down by what's happening and when we feel we're banging our heads against the wall, you too are living a life of advocacy for patients or for communities. Do you have some advice to us when we feel sometimes stuck, indifferent, and somehow apathetic because we feel that we're fighting battles that are against us and battles that are larger than us and battles that are likely we will not win them?
Well, I felt that many times, but I felt that some years ago, and I was talking to my dad. And, he's a theist. He believes in God. He's a Christian, and I said, and I'm not usually down, and he could see that something was wrong. He said, "What's wrong, John?" And I said, this work and this world, I don't know if I can do this by myself. He just paused for a second. He said, "Well, the good thing is you're not by yourself." And he said, "You're doing work, and from his perspective, God is always with you." But I think, and that actually helped, even though I'm not a theist. What he's saying is you're never alone. You don't know how things are going to turn out. And so one of the things I would say going from here, and that one of the potentials of this effort is to create relationships with each other. I went to Stanford before most of you were born. There are 6, and now there are only 5, but there are 6 African Americans who, most of them went to Stanford, that every year we take a week or 2 and travel someplace. And it creates all kinds of stuff. I mean, we actually got to one place and people said, "Oh no, you made a mistake. You don't have this place." And so we got to North Carolina and we had to rent a house, and we didn't have a house all of a sudden. But the taking time to acknowledge each other, to taking time to enjoy, to taking time to recharge, which sometimes we don't give ourselves permission to do. It's really important because, as they say, it's not a sprint. We just did something over in Oakland. We bought out a theater at the Grand Lake Theater twice in the last month. And once was a free showing, invited the community to come see the Black Panther. And then we had a panel discussion afterwards. And then a few weeks later, we invited the community again to come see A Wrinkle in Time. Black Panther, from my perspective, was a better movie. It was a good turnout. But the showing of Wrinkle in Time, which was disproportionate young girls of color, was so much more infectious. I mean, to see 12 and 13 and 6-year-old girls just giggling and having a good time, again, it was healing for us older folks who are out there in the trenches. So I would say, again, it can't be that you postpone all of your joy, all of your fun until we won. And I'll just stop by saying there was a movie, a documentary several years ago, and it was of children in Brazil who are without parents, and many of them without homes. And the documentarian followed them around, and the film became controversial because in the midst of the film, you saw these kids having so much fun. And it wasn't glorifying poverty. It wasn't Donald Trump saying, "Look at these people, they're happy." But they're still complex beings. And so I would say we're all complex beings, and we have relationships. And if we can sort of allow for, deliberately allow for that space. When some of my friends come to town, I take them to get a massage. Something that's that simple, and now they call and say, "I'm coming out, can we go get a massage?" And then we have to go back to try to save the world.
Well, yeah, this is this human being, and which Dr. Powell talks so eloquently about. I bounce across generations to inspire me. A lot of people know very close to my mom, who's 92, and think about how hard she tries to, be a role model for us. And I think about what my dad would have wanted me to do, and he was tough. So I have this, role model who would say to me, "Get back to it," So I have that perfect combination of accepting whatever I do and just serving as a model, and the other one that says, "You can do a little more, you can do a little better." And then, it's my grandkids and my, watching them, and you learn so much watching how their brains are developing. So, and then there are the fellows. There isn't a day that goes by when I'm not inspired by watching one of the fellows look after a patient, think about a project. So, yeah, we're in a pretty rich environment, I think, that's for sure.
We had a question from Bev Skeggs, the director of the International Inequalities Institute in the London School of Economics. And he asked, how does empathy work with or against other affects? For example, ethnographic research shows that for some people, hate is a pleasurable affect. How do we replace negative affects with ones that are positive if they serve to reduce anxiety and offer pleasure?
Yeah, well, you know, the biology of anger, we don't know much about this. My friend Steve Reed thinks that this really belongs as a diagnostic category. I mean, and how can you be empathic when you're angry, anxious, agitated? And for reasons that I think we don't understand, men, I think in particular, are predisposed to this unbelievable, ceaseless anger. And these are people that cause the most problems in a family, in a society. And the biology of that, to me, remains an incredible mystery. But I think Dr. Powell would probably understand the socioeconomic factors associated with this. But these are people who hurt other people.
Well, Dr. Miller talked about the brain sort of interacting with the environment. And so I don't think you're going to find necessarily an anger gene or anger, it's like we're dealing with the brain is incredibly complex. And then we throw in society, it's like, so we don't, so part of the thing from my perspective, and you're scientists, and for years I was very dismissive of faith-based religion. And the part that disturbed me the most was the faith. It's like, you don't have to know, you just have faith. It's like, really? Come on now. But since then, I've actually changed my position. Not necessarily because I think the hubris coming out of the Enlightenment Project and the Reformation and all that was the belief that we could know everything. And so there's a certain hubrisness that goes with that. And in some sense, the goal of the Enlightenment was to shine a light so bright that all knowledge was illuminated throughout the universe. What if that doesn't work? And there's a German philosopher I like named Gadamer, and he says, everything that reveals also conceals. So that you're never going to have perfect knowledge. And yet you have to act. And so I don't know why certain things happen, even in me, let alone, it's like I'm a mystery to myself. And as we study brain science, most of us are. I was giving a lecture and I was saying about how much we don't know about ourselves. And there was a guy who got to question and answers, and he took exception to that. He said, Professor Powell, you haven't met me, you haven't spent time with me, so you don't know me. How can you say that? I said, I'm not claiming I know you. You're missing the point. I'm saying you don't know you either. But it's okay. And I think, plus I think the way we organize and engage the environment creates different possibilities. And yeah, we can't with impunity allow people to hurt other people. But we can do better than just thinking that you hurt me, so now I'm going to hurt you back. So Dr. Miller's right. Most of the anger, most of the killings, most of the guns, there's something funny about the male species. We're a violent set. But we can't give up. And at the same time, like I said, wonderful things can happen. But there is some things which are interesting. There's some research showing that in terms of group decisions, that groups that have a certain percentage, I think it's up to 60 or 70% women, tend to make better decisions. So there's an answer right there. But it's very serious that women participating in things tend, and it's not to say they're not, obviously, there's Margaret Thatcher and women who can be just as brutal as men in any given, but as a collective group, it seems that it militates some of the violence and aggression, not just in humans, but even in baboons. When tribes of baboon become matriarchal, they tend to be less aggressive. And they tend to control male aggression in a different way. So maybe there's a lesson there, I don't know.
Well, GBHI follows that principle because we are 80% women, I think. So I think we're in pretty good shape.
That
Is it
explains
90?
a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we just, again, we have this very complicated biology. We wouldn't even be talking about this if our brains were better organized. If, you know, in 1995, I went to a conference. It was very moving. It was in Spain, and it was about violence. And the goal of the people was to write a Valencia statement. Violence is not in our genes. And as a biologist, you know, we come with a very violent past, and it's not an accident. This is something that we live with a brain that is capable of violence and anger and hurting, and we hunted and we killed. So I think this is, you know, one of the complex problems that we have to think about when we talk about framing how a society is run, what we value in group. And Bob Sapolsky, my neighbor, has a wonderful story about baboons, and he talks about aging baboons. And there are two kind of leaders that they have in the baboon society. And one is violent, tough, vindictive, hurts other primates. And when that primate gets a little bit older, they are shunned by the society. As soon as they can be defeated physically, they're gone. And then there are other leaders that Bob has watched, and they're different, and they're more like the last president that we had, and they are gentle, and they are thoughtful, and they are empathic. And ultimately, the baboons keep them, even if they're not any longer in this leading of the pack. And it's because the other baboons respect their values. They feel these values. They're different.
So Dr. Miller, you're not saying we're going to have to wait until this baboon and the wild hogs get old, are you? No, we were. I hope we would just have to wait till November.
You said something, Dr. Powell. You said the world is getting smaller and smaller. And again, I'll take it back to a quote from Martin Luther King saying, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." The word's shrinking, and we have to learn how to live with each other and how to be empathic to one another. Machines and technologies seems to be replacing human beings, but the thing that human beings are good at is empathy. It's this glue that ties in the human family together. That's why we have to cherish it. That's why we have to nourish it, and we have to keep spreading it. On this happy notion, how about we end here and start taking questions?
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Whoever has a burning question, please go up to the microphone and feel free to ask our guests questions.
I'm Leah Greenberg. I'm here from UCSF and GBHI. And thank you very much for coming and for talking to us. So one thing that really caught my attention all the time is sometimes we hear about how our brain can be disrupted and influence our behavior. And we also have some work here at UCSF showing that there is a lot of disruptions of this brain that we can identify in criminals. They are in jail. So in jail we find some of them. So at which point we have to draw a line of free will versus biology? And how does it change in our society here in the US or in other parts of the world that you've been at? I'm from Brazil, so I think things there are a little bit different than here, but maybe model over what the US showed the world. And I would love to hear more about it. I mean, this difference between biology and free will and how we can make people accountable or not for what they do.
I'll say something, Leah, which no one will like very much, but here you go. This is a biologist talking. So we had a really brilliant talk from a guy named David Bennett, who was studies people over the age of 80 with brain disease. And he's shown us that it isn't simple. There are about 25 proteins that aggregate. So he was going on, and he goes, well, 50% of the cognitive disorder in our population is the Alzheimer protein. And then 22% is the Lewy body protein. And then 15% is vascular. And so it was starting to, total up a lot. And so I asked him, where is free will here, David? There wasn't a lot of free will in this very different kind of population. But I think the biological determinants are important, but so much, the way the society organizes a system can logically predict whether we'll have young men who are hurting other people or whether they are part of a system that is loving and helping. And so I don't think, when you think of the big picture of behavior that like to blame people very much.
I think of people as largely situational. So in terms of what used to be called advanced democracies, or now we might call them declining democracies, the United States is by far the most violent country in the world. We have more guns, we have more killings, we have more people in prison. I don't think you can explain that in terms of biology. I don't think there's a special gene associated with the United States. But the capacity obviously is there, and we've taken that capacity and created the conditions to allow it to be expressed. We just go, a few miles up north to our Canadian friends, and many of the same demographics, radically different in terms of killings, in terms of prison incarceration, in terms of even things, assaults against women. Just so, it's incredible, it's shocking how different it is. And in Canada, not perfect by any means, but when you're in prison, the whole country, you remain the right to vote. In the United States, there's some states, even after you're out of prison, you don't have the right to vote. 1.2 million people in Florida, even after out of the prison, they can't vote. And some of you may know, Toronto, by some accounts, is the most diverse city in the world. So it's not that it's just all white people. But there's a different system, there's a different environment, there's a different story. If you go to Toronto, or for that matter, London, you see signs all up saying stuff like, we've been waiting for you, for the immigrants. Come to the United States, and we talk about building walls. So I don't think you can explain that in terms of biology. So there's an interaction between the biology and the environment. And I think it's, and the other thing I would say is that, the brain is incredibly complicated, but you add the environment, and then you get into essentially systems theory. That systems are so complex. There's I'm trying to think of the novel, I can't think of the name of it. It's a novel, I think it's called The Three Body. It's a Chinese novelist. He writes about this society which has three suns. And the gist of it is this, that if you're predicting movement with one sun, you can do that. When you add a second sun, it becomes really complicated. When you add three suns, it becomes infinitely complicated. And so these beings develop in response to this environment that's so much more complicated than ours, and they're much more complicated beings, much more complicated environment. So what I'm suggesting is that in this complicated environment, I don't know what free will is. The way we used to think about it certainly doesn't work. But if you have a complicated system, it's hard to sort of, they used to say if you have 5 people in the room, you have 6 minds. The whole idea of emergent principles, and not just the brain, the whole body. So I think we have to, for a while, accept we don't know, and 2, maybe ascribe certain things, right? It's like we expect you to do certain things with or without free will, however you get there. I was meeting with a reporter, and they said, so tell me your story. And I said, well, we all have stories. Most of them are not true. We make up stories. They're fragmented. I don't believe that I have a coherent picture of myself that I can trust. And the reporter, she wasn't having it. She said, okay, so make up one. I mean, I'm not an academic. I need a story for my newspaper. So we may have to make up stuff. We may have to create certain expectations, certain ways of holding each other responsible. Even if we say we're not ultimately free will in the most narrow sense that we think of.
Any other questions?
So, but you heard me? Good. Well, I have, bear with me while I build my question. I'm originally from Venezuela, which is a country that was destroyed by the left. And nowadays I live in Israel, which is a country that's going every day more to the right direction. And by right, I don't mean the good direction, I mean the right. Which is also a problem. So I have a really big problem defining myself, okay? I believe that I'm center, and I don't want to be extremist to any side. But when I try to empathize with people from whoever they are or they come from, it's really hard to, because they have assumptions about me because of where I'm coming from. And also when I see their views, and we see that here also in San Francisco, mainly with the political view, that if I didn't obviously vote for Trump because I'm not from here and I would never vote for him even if I was. But if I was a Trump voter, I would feel really like I don't belong here or they don't want me here. So how can we, when we talk about belonging, use the language that will get to the people that it's hard for us to connect with? Because those are the people actually that we want to connect with. And I feel it also when we talk about empathy. Sometimes when we see Josh's video that was amazing, I wonder to myself, is that video I see us smiling and I say, oh, but I like that. And I know I like it. And we all work here because we care about empathy. How do we get and how can we use our tools to get to those people that don't feel us? Thank you.
Good question. So I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at a church, and black church in Berkeley, and a friend of mine was a pastor there, and I talked about bridging and empathy and a circle of human concern when no one's outside the circle, and he said, so you're telling me that I have to bridge with the devil? And I said, I wouldn't suggest you start there. Bridging in some ways, you think about it, is, so first of all, you have to accord someone their own humanity, their own agency. And you don't have to, that doesn't mean, so I can acknowledge someone's humanity without embracing their activity. We talked earlier about anger, and I always like to cite Reverend Dr. King on this. He talked about righteous indignation. Just, you have to be careful with that, but he's basically saying to injure God's creation, us, the earth itself, creates indignation. So he's saying there are reasons to be angry. When you're watching someone hurt someone else, or yourself, you're not passive about that. You're not saying, so to me, to talk about bridging, it's not a placid, neutral space. It's saying, I stand for something. I stand for the dignity, the value of human life. And someone who takes exception to that, I will challenge them, but not with the idea that I want to take their life. That I'm saying, that's not allowed. There's a book by James Baldwin called The Price of the Ticket. I don't know if you know James Baldwin, a famous African-American writer who's also gay. He, at the height of his literary career, people invited him to join high society, which means white. And they said, Mr. Ball, we acknowledge you can write. Begrudgingly, we acknowledge you can write. And so we asked you to join this famous literary community. We know you're black and, unfortunate, but it's true. As you come to this community, don't bring the fact that you're gay in our face. And so James Baldwin declined, and he said he wrote a book called The Price of the Ticket. And he's saying, I want to belong. I'm a writer. But the cost of my humanity was too much. And so when I think of people, we have a responsibility to each other. And so whether what they call the far left, the far right, societies, people who would injure other people, we have to stop them. And there will be some people who absolutely don't want to empathize with me, who don't want to bridge with me. I will still leave the door open. But I can't control that person. I can't make that person see my humanity. But I can struggle to see that person's humanity. So I think that's the challenge. It's not like, people are puppets and we just change their brain a little bit and we fix them. And that's why when I told the story true story about World War I, Hitler was an outlier. He had hundreds of soldiers saying, let's lay down our weapons. And he said, no, let's kill them. Could Dr. Miller have gotten to Hitler and said, we need to fix that gene? And, you're obviously, I don't know. So when people sort of categorically deny someone else's humanity, someone else's right to be on the planet, that has to be opposed. And you can call it left or right or center, but it seems to me that has to be opposed.
Yeah, having gone through lots of demonstrations as a kid in the 60s, I thought what I was doing was important, and I still do. And I'm hoping there's a new generation of kids that will start demonstrating about guns and, changing our society. But it wasn't so easy, and I think in some ways it was dehumanizing to shout, to argue, to voice opinions that were not popular, and I didn't enjoy it very much. I think in retrospect, I wondered whether tactics that were used during that time aren't part of the blowback that we got with our new president. And so I think the way that this is done is, as Dr. Powell points out, by action and example is really important. And I think I'm not going to be the guy who's going to Charlottesville talking to that group of people, but somebody should, somebody will. And I think the very interesting thing about the biology of that group of men, maybe 99% men, is very interesting to me. It needs to be studied. I do think some of these kids have smaller right temporal lobes and really have a hard time ever feeling other people's humanity. And then there are others that get caught in a vicious loop, obsessive loop, where nothing comes in, no real genetics, no real facts about other people, where one thought focused around hate goes round and round. That's not normal. That's a very bad outcome for a human being. But I think of that group of kids mostly that were demonstrating, I'm sure there's a percentage of them where that loop can be broken, where they do have brain structure that can develop empathy and change. And so I think who talks to them is very important.
Any other questions, or should we
I think you have
wrap
one.
up?
There's one.
Oh, just one. Go, Phaedra.
Hi, I'm Phaedra Bell. I'm one of the Atlantic Fellows for Equity and Brain Health here at UCSF. And Professor Powell, I was wondering if you might be willing to take a little minute to educate those of us who may not be as familiar with the idea of structural inequity. I think it would be great to hear just a little primer from you about that. That would be terrific.
So it's actually interesting. Thanks for the question. One of the things they say in the brain science is that people, especially in individualistic societies like our own, we tend to oversubscribe, overly attribute things to personal. So it's like, and even, I mean, you've seen these games, I'm sure, where the games are rigged, and yet when people win on a rigged game, they still think, well, it's because I'm smart, it's because I'm, and not that the game was rigged. I'm on a group now that's actually looking at the lack of mobility in the United States. Increasingly, if you're born in the lower middle class, more so than in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you're going to die in the lower middle class. And so there's a commission that Gates has created, and that's not attributable to your personal efforts. If you look at people succeeding, a better indication of your success of even quitting smoking is your network. So we're such social beings that if you surround your people who don't smoke, it's a better chance you won't smoke. And so the social network and the structural network is so important in terms of our life outcomes. We do something called opportunity mapping, where we literally can map out opportunity, which has a very strong predictor of your life outcomes, including how long you're going to live. This is beyond your individual attributes. I'm not saying you don't have individual attributes, but the structure matters. And so we don't pay much attention to it. Now think about it. 30 years ago in this building, if someone was in a wheelchair, they couldn't get in the building. That's the structure. And there's structures like that all over the place. So one of my favorite, and they're changing this in California, is in stadiums, bathrooms. During halftime, going to the bathroom, the stadiums were basically large urinals, and you had women literally having rise and stress in these long lines while the men are in and out, in and out, in and out. That's a structure. And that structure is actually distributing stress to women. And it's not because the person who designed it said, I'm going to fix my wife. I'm going to make sure she can't go to the bathroom. And there are things like that all over. So when we start to look at, structures aren't neutral. And so I talk about structural inclusion. Not just, when we think about structural discrimination, we think about removing the barriers, like to the, let's have a ramp or some, but that's not good enough. Structures are affirmatively doing work. So how do we organize structures to actually make sure they're doing the work we want to do for all the people we're trying to engage? Now that's counterintuitive certainly for Americans. We're thinking like, I'll do this on my own, so that's part of what I mean by things like structural racialization. We have systems that other people. Here's a very simple example, then I'll stop. I went to an event and we had translation. So the main speakers were speaking English, and then we translated it into Spanish. And I'd gone to something earlier that had an impact on me, so we switched this up. And the thing earlier, similar, I'd gone to a school for the deaf, and all the communication was in sign, and people were communicating, and then we had earphones, and they were translating to us. We were hearing it, right? We were hearing it, but we actually felt marginalized. We felt like, everybody else is laughing and carrying on, and it's like a 2-minute delay. And the four of us with earphones, it's like, oh, okay, so that's what but they're on to something else. So when we had this thing where we had translation from English to Spanish, then we flipped it. We had people speaking Spanish and translated to English. And for the English speaker, it was a shock. That didn't feel right. It didn't feel quite comfortable. So there's a structural dynamic. And we thought we had fixed it by doing the translation, but it still had a bias associated with it. So part of it is for us to be sensitive to what the structures are doing. And the obvious example is climate change. We all, most of us, I don't know where you live, but many people who care about the climate, after they go to a great event, they'll get in their gasoline car and they'll drive. They're contributing to, collectively contributing to a very destructive set of outcomes. Not because they're bad people, not because they're evil, but we have a structure that makes it easy to do that and hurt the earth and thereby hurt ourselves. And we do the same thing in terms of people.
Well, thank you very much. This was such an honor to sit here with you and to listen to you. I'm sure same for the audience. Our time's up, unfortunately. We would love to continue this. Thanks.